The Golden Bowl by Marjorie Cowley, read by Brian Henderson. This video is intended for education purposes only, all rights reserved to the author and the publisher. Chapter 10 City Made of Mud. Pulling Zephyr behind him, Jomar almost danced with relief as they walked toward the gateway. You were brave to sing for the gatekeeper. I would never have thought to ask you to do that. I know. That's why I decided to sing my song, Zephyr said quietly. As they moved through the immense wooden doors, Jomar wondered where the timber came from and how it got here. The noises of the city, loud cries, snatches of music, the hum of conversation, the scrape of wooden cartwheels, came from every direction. People of all ages and manner of dress surged around them. Staring at an elegant woman, Zephyr stopped and stood rooted. The woman wore a tight gown that left one shoulder bare, and her coiled braids were wound twice around her head. When they were jostled by impatient people trying to get around them, Jomar grasped Zephyr's arm again and moved her forward. The delicious scent of onions and spices filled the air, as well as the more pungent odors of raw fish and mutton. Jomar and Zephyr stood on tiptoe to see over the crush of milling people. Stalls and tables were jammed into the slender shadow of the city's wall, and a boundless array of goods lay spread out on the tables or hung from hooks. Pierce shells to decorate your finest clothes. Ivory buttons and pearls from the sea sold here, a vendor shouted. I've never seen pearls before, Zephyr whispered to Jomar. They glisten like little moons. My final offer, a gruff voice rang out from the crowd. I'll give you half your asking price for 5 buttons I doubt are really ivory. Another vendor spoke in a coaxing tone. Here's a lapis lazuli necklace to bring joy to your wife. Zephyr gazed at the strange blue beads flecked with yellow that the merchant held up high. How mother would love that necklace, she said. A high-pitched woman's voice cried out, The sweetest honey-baked cakes and the best barley bread in are here. Jomar's stomach rumbled. There is so much food here. Had all the grain, all the honey, all the meat come from the countryside where farmers starved? When Zephyr reached out towards the loaves of bread stacked on a table, the vendor impatiently shooed her hand away as if it were a fly. Jomar was stung by this rudeness. Where did the baker think the barley came from? He suddenly saw himself as a young boy. Wet with sweat, he ran behind his father's plow to remove clods of dirt from the new furrows so that the tender barley seeds could sprout. Leaving the baker, they heard tiny music. A small band of thin, raggedy children were playing a lute, rattles, a reed pipe, and a tambourine. When Zephyr stopped to listen, they gathered in front of her to sing and play a lively tune that repeated 2 strong beats, followed by a pause. At the end of the song, the boy with the tambourine turned it over and held it out. Close to tears, Zephyr said, I've nothing to give you. The children's gaunt faces fell. Then they scurried away. Come on, Jomar said briskly. We should find the goldsmith's house as soon as possible. Zephyr dragged her feet. I won't be welcome there. You'll get a meal at least, Jomar said. And then? Zephyr asked, her voice trailing off. And then, I don't know, Jomar sighed. Father told me Sidah and his wife live in back of the temple. We must be close to it, he said with forced conviction. He hurried Zephyr along, careful to keep out of the way of bustling people and laden donkeys. They came upon a bridge that was crowded with people looking down at a large canal at the bottom of steep earthen walls. Even from a distance, they could sense the excitement of those people packed together on the bridge. Coming closer, they heard fragments of conversation. Killing a free man is serious, a prosperous-looking man said. Better if he'd been a slave. A shabbily dressed young man responded, Slave or free, let him drown if he's guilty. A mother holding her baby spoke up. He says he didn't do it, so let the river decide. Hearing the animated talk, Zephyr shuddered. I don't want to go any closer. Then stay here, Jomar said. I'm going to find out what's happening. He spoke briefly to a woman carrying a basket of dried fish, then returned to Zephyr. A man charged with killing another man will be thrown into the canal, Jomar said. If he comes to the surface and manages to get out of the canal, he'll be judged innocent. If he drowns, they believe that he's guilty. He shook his head. I've never heard of such a cruel custom. Zephyr looked sharply at him. You sound like you don't believe in the test. When Jomar didn't answer her challenge, she sighed and let him lead her away from the bridge. The next street they tried was a jumble of mud-colored brick houses and shops. Most of the buildings were squat, like their own farmhouse, but they walked by a two-storied house with jutting balconies that was surrounded by fruit trees and flowering bushes. Zephyr slowed down. This looks like a palace from one of the stories that Mother used to tell me, all about the adventures of god kings. Her voice trembled. I want to go home. Jomar took Zephyr's arm. Keep walking. Disoriented and hungry, they wandered through the streets of the city until they stood in front of the temple. It was far larger and more complex than Jomar remembered, and so sprawling it looked like a city within a city. Pillars and buttresses soared out of the tawny earth. Mud brick walls gleamed with small cones of black, red, and white that formed precise patterns of zigzags, spirals, and triangles. Confident people dressed in linen and sheepskin climbed the stairs toward the huge wooden double doors. This is where the moon god lives, Jomar said. His home is grander than any palace from one of Mother's stories. As they circled the temple, they found clusters of mud brick houses and shops jammed against the temple walls and one another. Jomar stopped a man leading a donkey piled with pottery. Do you know where the goldsmith Sidah lives? Never heard of him, the man said. When three more people gave Jomar the same answer, Jomar grasped how big the city was. The people in his village would have known the name and whereabouts of everyone who lived there or in the surrounding farms. Jomar kept asking about Sita until an old woman wordlessly pointed out a small brick house on the narrow street that looked the same as all the others. When they got closer, Jomar saw that the design of a tool had been deeply etched into a brick placed over the door. It was a tool he was unfamiliar with. This must be the mark of a goldsmith. The door to the house was open. They could smell cooked cabbage and onions. With Zephyr clutching his arm, Jomar stepped over the threshold. Chapter 11. The Goldsmith's House. The small dark room they entered was mercifully cooler than the sun-baked streets. A man and a woman sat silently, eating their midday meal at a small wooden table. Are you Sidah? Jomar asked, bowing his head to the lean and graying man who was about the same age as his father. The man rose and looked somberly at him. I've been waiting for you, Jomar, son of Durabi. He turned to Zephyr. But who is this? Jomar hesitated, then took Zephyr's hand and brought her forward. Zephyr, my sister. Sidah and his wife said nothing, but Jomar knew by their narrowed eyes that they were displeased. Jomar spoke to the woman, hoping she might be as kind-hearted as his mother. There's not enough food on the farm to feed us all, so at the last moment my father decided to send her here with me. Sidah's wife stared coldly at Zephyr, so he appealed to the goldsmith. I beg you to let her stay here until she finds work. Sidah shook his head forcefully. Durabi didn't speak of a daughter. He and I had an agreement. She wasn't part of it. Sidah's wife rose from her chair. This house is small. Our food supply's meager. The goldsmith's expression softened. Nari, look how thin and worn these children are. Feed and house this girl tonight. Tomorrow she'll go. They're dirty, Nari said. They'll eat when they've bathed and changed their clothes. Motioning curtly that Jomar and Zephyr should follow her, she led them outside to a tiny mud brick shed next to the house. On the clay floor rested a jug of water, a cake of strong-smelling tallow and ash soap, and a heavy, long-handled reed brush. Come back when you've scrubbed yourselves clean. In the washroom, Zephyr spoke in a low tone. Did you see how she looks at me? I'm a stranger to her, yet she hates me. Yes, she's unfriendly to both of us, Jomar said, but you're being allowed to stay the night. That was the goldsmith's decision, not hers. Zephyr took off her tunic and began to scrub herself vigorously in anger, exaggerated movements. This house is too quiet. Don't they have children? Only one child, a boy my age. Jomar took the soap and brush that Zephyr handed him. He died recently. I'm here to take his place. As their son, Zephyr said indignantly. You have a father and mother. I mean his place as Sidah's apprentice, Jomar said quietly. He fingered his shabby tunic. Without my basket, I have no change of clothing. Scrub yourself and leave your tunic on your cot before you go to sleep, Zephyr said. I'll find a way to wash it. From her basket, she took out her one clean garment and put it on. Then, with a private half-smile, she circled her braids twice around her head. When they returned to the house, Sidah invited them to the table with a quick gesture. Without a glance or smile, Nari put down 2 bowls of soup. Following Zepha's lead, Jomar did not gulp down his food. The meal disappeared in moments, but Nari did not offer them a second serving. Jomar saw that the goldsmith was looking at him with sad eyes. He's wishing his son sat at the table instead of me, Jomar thought, wondering if a sickness had caused his death. Sidah gave a little shudder as if to throw off his thoughts and rose from the table. Come, I'll get you started. Without waiting for Jomar to follow him, he disappeared into another room that opened off from the living quarters. The goldsmith's wife spoke to Zepha directly for the first time. You've no right to be here, so you'll have to work for me to earn your keep until you leave tomorrow. Clear the table, pick over the lentils, then boil them for tomorrow's meal. She left the table and went outside. Jomar had seen his sister's eyes harden as she listened to Nari, and once with motion, Zepha loosened her crown and braids. Why did you do that? Jomar said. I liked your braids piled high. Because I'm a slave, not a lady, she said angrily. Jomar put a finger to his lips. Lower your voice. They don't know you're a slave. Remember, you're better off cooking for her instead of for Malik and his crew. Zepha stacked the bowls on the table with abrupt movements. Jomar started off from the workshop. Chapter 12. Sidah's Workshop. Determined not to be impressed by anything he saw, Jomar threw back his shoulders and stepped into a small whitewashed room. He looked coolly about him. The workshop was dimly lit by 3 small, high windows. 2 work tables took up most of the space. Jomar thought the small beehive-shaped furnace on the floor looked like his mother's oven for baking bread. Also on the floor were a blowpipe to get a fire going, a basket of charcoal, a bowl full of water, and a flat stone worn smooth. Various tools of different shapes and sizes hung from hooks on the wall. Some were familiar, but most were strange to him. He pointed to an elegant tool that stood out from the others. Isn't that the same tool that's carved into the brick over your door? Sidah nodded. They're tongs, mainly used to hold heated gold. Tongs to hold gold! Excited in spite of his resolve, Jomar knew he had entered another world. Something large and slender stood covered with a cotton cloth in one corner, but Jomar's eye was drawn to 3 small clay bowls that sat on a work table. In them were blue, red, and black stones. He pointed to the blue ones. A merchant in the bazaar this morning called these lapis lazuli. Did he? Sidah asked in a skeptical tone. You can't believe everything you hear in the city. The temple controls the lapis we import to make sacred objects and jewelry for important people. The gems are so costly and difficult to obtain that they are rarely sold on the streets. The beads you saw were probably fakes, made of clay and painted blue to look like lapis. Jomar felt like the farm boy he was. Where do the real ones come from? Sidah's voice took on a teaching tone as he pointed to the 3 clay bowls in turn. Merchants travel over deserts or up snowy mountains to bring back red carnelian, black obsidian, and fine blue lapis. We have no splendid gems or gold, tin, or copper in this land. We lack stone quarries and even timber. Where did the wood of the great gate of Ur come from? Jomar asked. Huge logs from the northern mountains are roped together and floated down the river, Sidah answered. Jomar thought of the effort that must go into supplying the city with everything it needed or wanted. A merchant's life must be hard. Sidah nodded. Hard and risky, but if a trader returns with valuable goods, he can become rich, build a grand house, own many slaves. But he can lose everything to bandits, including his life. Sometimes the donkeys that pull his caravans die of thirst or exhaustion, or his richly laden boats may overturn in the river or the sea. Sidah's eyes clouded over and he stopped talking. Jomar waited for him to continue. When he didn't, he asked another question. What does the city trade for these foreign goods? Oil and spices, woven cotton and wool, and the tools and weapons we make from imported metal, Sidah answered. But mostly we trade with the surplus grain that's piled up in temple storehouses. Surplus grain? Jomar said, his voice rising. In this drought? What grain is surplus when those who live in the countryside go hungry? Sidah shook his head. You're not going to change the way the temple conducts its business. Farmers and merchants must contribute their produce to the temple so that its staff is fed. It's also used for trade. Sidah spoke sternly. The city lives on trade and would wither without it. Jomar was stung by Sidah's reproach. He said nothing, but his mind was filled with images of sun-baked barren fields, the bony cow, her hungry calf. Sidah picked up a thin rod of gold that was almost as tall as Zephyr. One end of the rod turned up at a sharp angle. I've just finished this drinking straw for a high-ranking priestess. Jomar took the rod that Sidah held out to him. This is so light. Sidah nodded. Inside is a hollow reed I've covered with gold foil no thicker than a moth's wing. Temple officials like to drink beer together out of a deep urn. He took back the tube and briefly put one end to his mouth. This reaches below the impurities that form on the surface of the brew. I thought spitting out bits of barley husk was part of beer drinking, Jomar said. Sidah had a hint of a smile on his face. Important people don't like to spit. Jomar grinned. How do you get the gold, the gemstones, your tools? Sidah swept the room with his hand. The temple provides me with a steady supply of the materials to make whatever those at the temple need, or think they need. Jomar pointed at the long drinking rod. Except for this, I see little gold. Sidah's expression hardened. Gold is far too rare and valuable to be kept here. Thieves will risk everything to obtain it. Jomar knew Sidah would view him with suspicion until he could prove to him he could be trusted. Sidah waved a hand around the room. You've had a long journey, but I want to get you started with your training. One of your daily tasks will be to keep the workshop swept clean. The oven must be kept clear of ashes and the coals banked at the back of the oven to retain their heat. At the end of the day, the tools must be returned to the wall and hung on the same hooks. You must know each tool and its function. Some are new to me, Jomar murmured. Sidah nodded. I'll touch each tool, name it, and describe how it's used. After I'm finished, you'll repeat what I've told you. Slowly and methodically, Sidah went through every tool that hung from the wall. Then it was Jomar's turn, and he started off well. He pointed to familiar tools such as hammers and knives and described their function. But halfway through his assignment, he began to falter. When the name of the tool or its function escaped him, Jomar stammered. His pauses got longer and longer. The goldsmith must think he made a foolish agreement with my father. Sidah held his palm up and stopped the lesson. You have little knowledge of this craft, but if you're clever, you'll find out what you must know by watching me. He changed the subject abruptly. Your sister is a worry for all of us. Where will she seek work? I'm not sure, Jomar answered. She's good with farm animals, collecting dung for fire fuel, spinning wool. He trailed off, determined to honor the gatekeeper's warning not to speak of Zephah's musical skills to anyone. Those are country chores, Sidah said. Is overrun with farm and village people in need of work. Yes, Jomar said faintly. We saw many of them on the road. Sidah shook his head. The city is full of peril for a young country girl. She must find employment soon. Otherwise, you'll be forced to give up this apprenticeship in order to find her a secure place to live and earn her way. Jomar was startled. Leave my apprenticeship before it begins? He imagined himself and Zephyr wandering the city, hungry and homeless. Or worse, joining the people outside the city walls who were offering themselves as slaves in order to survive. A terrible weariness overcame him. Beneath the fatigue was fear.